The wind blew softly across the wide, open land as the stagecoach rattled down the dusty road. The horses' hooves made steady, rhythmic sounds, and the wheels creaked as they rolled over rough ground. The sun hung low, painting the sky in soft orange and gold. On the back seat, a young woman named Mei Lin held a small leather trunk tightly against her chest. She wore a plain dress, carefully mended in several places, and a thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her dark hair was neatly braided, though some strands had slipped loose from the long journey. Mei Lin's heart beat faster with every mile. She had traveled for weeks to reach this remote frontier town. Everything around her felt strange. The land, the language, the faces. But she had made a promise to herself when she left her village in China. She would not turn back. Life had already taken so much from her. This new land, even with all its unknowns, was her only chance to begin again. The stagecoach finally stopped in front of a wooden building with faded paint and a crooked sign that read, Rosewood Boarding House. Dust swirled around the wheels as the driver called out, "End of the line!" Mei Lin stepped down carefully, holding her trunk with both hands. The air was cool, sharp, and clean. She looked around. The town was small, made up of a few stores, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and houses with wide porches. A group of children ran by, laughing. A man led his horse toward the stables. In the distance, she saw endless grasslands stretching to the horizon. She stood still for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to find courage in the new air. This was it, her new beginning. Mrs. Rose, the owner of the boarding house, stepped out to greet her. She was a tall woman with gray hair tied in a bun and warm eyes that looked both kind and firm. "You must be Mei Lin," she said slowly, trying to make her words clear. Mei Lin nodded shyly, understanding just enough English to catch her name. Mrs. Rose smiled. "Come in, dear. We've been expecting you." Inside the boarding house, the smell of bread and warm soup filled the air. A fire burned softly in the stove and wooden chairs surrounded a long table. Mei Lin's eyes softened. For the first time in weeks, she felt something familiar, the warmth of a kitchen. It reminded her of home, of mornings in her village when her mother cooked rice while the sun rose. Mrs. Rose showed her a small room upstairs, just a bed, a table, and a single window. To Mei Lin, it felt like a palace. She placed her trunk on the floor and ran her hand gently over the quilted blanket. She had arrived with almost nothing but hope, and this little room became her safe corner in a new world. The next morning, she began to work. At dawn, she went down to the kitchen. The cook had left the town weeks earlier, so Mrs. Rose needed help. Mei Lin rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She chopped vegetables with quick, careful hands. She kneaded dough, stirred pots, and seasoned soups with herbs she had brought from home. When the boarders came downstairs, they found steaming bowls of noodles, soft bread, and broth that smelled like comfort. People who had never tasted Chinese food before took their first bites, and their eyes widened with surprise. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" one man asked with a grin. Mrs. Rose just laughed and said, "This young woman has golden hands." Word spread through the town faster than smoke in the wind. "There's a new cook at Rosewood. She's small, quiet, but her food tastes like magic." But not everyone welcomed her. Across the dirt road just opposite the boarding house stood a large ranch. It was owned by Daniel Hargrove, a man known across the frontier for his hard work and even harder temper. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself like someone who trusted only what he could build with his own two hands. Daniel had lived in the town all his life. He didn't like change, and he especially didn't like strangers. Every morning, Daniel stood by his fence with his arms crossed, watching as Mei Lin swept the porch. He never spoke a word to her, but his eyes said enough. They were cold and guarded, like the fence that separated his land from hers. Mei Lin noticed, of course, but she never reacted. She kept sweeping, her movements steady and calm, like flowing water over stone. One morning, while she hung clean, linens to dry, Daniel muttered to his ranch hand, "The town's changing too fast. Outsiders everywhere." Maylene didn't hear the words, but she felt the weight of his stare. Still, she chose silence. She had learned long ago that silence could be stronger than any reply. Life settled into a slow rhythm. Maylene cooked at dawn, cleaned during the day, and sometimes stood by the window at night watching the stars. The frontier sky was different from the one back home, wide, endless, and bright with 1,000 shining points. She would whisper to herself in Chinese, telling her heart to stay strong. She remembered the sea journey that brought her here, the promises of a husband she barely knew, and the quiet heartbreak of losing him so quickly. She had cried all her tears on the long boat ride. Here she would build something new. The townspeople slowly began to like her. The sheriff tipped his hat whenever he passed by. Children waved at her. Mrs. Rose's husband, Mr. Thomas, often said, "She's got the heart of a lion in that small body." But Daniel remained the same, distant and stern. One afternoon, as Maylene was carrying a basket of bread outside, a gust of wind caught the cloth and sent the loaves rolling onto the dusty road. She bent down to pick them up quickly, embarrassed. Just then Daniel's horse approached. The rancher pulled on the reins and stopped right in front of her. For a second, Maylene thought he might ride past without a word. Instead, Daniel leaned down, picked up the last loaf from the ground and handed it to her. His hands were rough and his expression unreadable. "Careful," he said in a low voice. "Wind here can be mean." She looked up, surprised to hear him speak. "Thank you," she replied softly. Her accent was strong, but her meaning was clear. Daniel nodded once, then rode away without another word. It was the first time he had spoken to her since she arrived. That night, Maylene couldn't stop thinking about the moment. It wasn't much, just a simple act of kindness. But it cracked the wall of silence between them, even if just a little. The days grew colder as autumn turned to winter. The golden fields around the town became pale and stiff with frost. The river slowed, and the winds carried the scent of snow. Business at the boarding house grew busy. Travelers passing through, the frontier came in hungry, tired, and grateful for a warm bowl of soup. Maylene worked from morning until night, but she didn't complain. She liked the way the kitchen smelled, like a place where stories began. Sometimes, when she opened the kitchen window, she saw Daniel working at his ranch. He moved with the strength of someone who had spent years shaping the land. Though his face was serious, Maylene noticed small things. How he helped his workers fix the fence, how he led the horses gently, how he stared at the sky as if searching for answers. She began to wonder if his silence wasn't anger, but something else. Something quieter. One evening, after everyone at the boarding house had eaten, Maylene sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of warm tea. She placed her hands around the cup and stared at the steam curling into the air. For the first time in a long while, she felt a small flicker of peace inside her chest. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she had a place to sleep, work to do, and people who were slowly beginning to see her for who she was. Not just where she came from, but the world outside was not always so gentle. Winter on. The frontier was harsh, and whispers of a big storm were already moving through town. Some said it would be the worst winter in years. As the nights grew colder and the wind began to howl across the empty plains, Maylene wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She didn't know that soon, her path and Daniel's would cross again. Not through chance, but through a storm that would test everyone's strength. Still, for now, the kitchen was warm. The lantern light glowed softly against the wooden walls. She closed her eyes, whispered a short prayer in her language, and smiled quietly to herself. She had survived so much already. Whatever was coming, she would face it with the same steady courage she carried across the sea. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the dry grass near Daniel's ranch. Across the road, he stood on his porch watching the lights from the boarding house kitchen flicker through the night. For a moment, his frown softened. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the smell of bread that carried on the wind. Maybe it was the memory of the woman on the road with the loaf in her hands. Either way, the quiet story between the rancher and the cook had already begun. Snow began to fall earlier than anyone expected that year. At first, it came as a soft mist of white, gently covering the fields around the little town. But within a few days, the wind grew stronger and the snow became thick and heavy, covering everything in sight. The townspeople hurried to prepare for the storm. Wood was stacked, windows were covered, and animals were brought inside barns. Everyone knew that a frontier winter could be long and hard. Inside the boarding house, Maylene worked without rest. She boiled soup, baked bread, and made tea to keep everyone warm. Travelers arrived almost every hour, their clothes frozen, their boots covered in snow. Mrs. Rose turned no one away. Soon, every bed was full, and people began to sleep in chairs and on the floor near the warm kitchen stove. Maylene didn't complain. She stayed in the kitchen day and night, wrapping a scarf around her hair, her hands moving quickly. She chopped vegetables, stirred pots, and filled bowls one after another. The fire made her cheeks glow red. Even though her feet ached, her heart stayed strong. She had known hunger before, and she did not want anyone in this house to feel it. Across the road, Daniel Hargrove's ranch also felt the storm's weight. His workers were stuck indoors. The horses needed feeding, and the cattle were restless in the cold. Daniel had always been proud of handling everything on his own. But that night he faced something different. The storm was too strong. The food he had stored for the ranch hands began to run low. He stared out the window at the snow falling thick and endless. He didn't like asking for help, but deep down he knew there was only one warm kitchen in town that still had enough food for everyone. Meanwhile, Maylene wrapped a blanket around a crying child, handing her a warm bun, fresh from the oven. The girl smiled through her tears. Moments like that made Maylene feel useful, as if this place truly needed her. Mrs. Rose walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're saving lives tonight, dear," she said softly. Maylene smiled, though she felt the weight of tiredness in her bones. Hours passed. The wind howled like a lonely voice outside. The lanterns flickered and snow kept piling against the door. Then, just before midnight, a loud knock echoed through the boarding house. Everyone turned. Mrs. Rose opened the door, and there stood Daniel Hargrove, his hat covered in snow, his face cold and serious. Behind him were two of his ranch hands, pale and shivering. One of them could barely stand. "Mrs. Rose," Daniel said, his voice low but clear. "We need help." The boarding house fell silent. Maylene stepped out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. It was the first time Daniel had ever come this close to her. Their eyes met. His were no longer cold or distant. They were tired, worried, and filled with something she recognized very well: fear for people he cared about. Mrs. Rose didn't hesitate. "Come in," she said. "No one gets left out in a storm like this." The men entered, bringing with them a rush of icy air. Maylene quickly led them toward the fire, covering the weakest man with a thick blanket. She handed them hot tea without a word. Daniel watched her closely. She moved with quiet strength, not seeking thanks, only doing what needed to be done. For the next few hours, Maylene cooked even more food. She worked until her hands were red and warm from the heat of the stove. Daniel sat near the fire, holding his hat in his hands. He had spent years thinking he didn't need anyone. But watching Maylene work, he felt something shift inside him, like ice cracking after a long freeze. Later that night, when most people had fallen asleep, Daniel walked into the kitchen. Maylene was still there, rolling dough on the table. The sound of the wind outside was softer now. "You didn't have to help us," Daniel said quietly. Maylene looked up, surprised to hear his gentle voice. She shook her head. "No one should be hungry," she said in her slow but clear English. He nodded. For a moment, they just stood there in silence, listening to the storm outside. Then Daniel said something he had never said to her before. "Thank you." The words were simple but honest. Maylene gave a small smile, the first smile she had ever shared with him. The days that followed were some of the hardest the town had ever seen. Snow buried the roads and travelers couldn't leave. Supplies were short, but Maylene made every piece of bread, every spoon of soup stretch as far as possible. Daniel and his men came back every day to help. He chopped wood for the boarding house. His ranch hands carried water and cleared snow. It was no longer just Maylene working to keep everyone warm. It was a whole town coming together. And every day, something quiet grew between Daniel and Maylene. It wasn't loud or fast. It was small moments. The way he passed her firewood without a word. The way she handed him a bowl of soup with a soft thank you. The way their eyes met and held for just a second longer than before. One evening, after a long day, Maylene stepped outside for a breath of cold air. The sky was dark, but the stars shone brightly, their light reflecting on the snow. She wrapped her shawl tighter and stared up, whispering a short prayer to the stars. She didn't hear Daniel walk up behind her until he said, "Cold night." She turned and saw him standing there with his hands in his pockets. He wasn't wearing his usual hard expression. His face looked calm, almost gentle. "Yes," she said softly. "But stars, beautiful." Daniel looked up at the sky too. "I never paid much attention to them," he admitted. "But you're right. They are." For the first time they talked, not about food or work, but about their lives. Maylin told him about her village in China, about her mother teaching her to cook, about the sea voyage that brought her here. Daniel told her about growing up on the ranch, about his father, about losing people too soon. Their stories were different, but the feelings were the same. Two people who had both known loss, now standing under the same winter stars. By the time the storm finally ended, the town was different. People had helped one another like never before. And Daniel was no longer the man who stood behind his fence with cold eyes. He came to the boarding house often, at first to help fix things the storm had broken, then to stay a little longer each time. He started bringing her flour from the mill, fresh eggs from the ranch, and sometimes just quiet company. The townspeople noticed. Mrs. Rose would smile softly whenever Daniel showed up at the door. The children giggled, but Maylin didn't think much about what others thought. She only knew that life had changed in quiet, gentle ways. She no longer felt like a stranger in this town. She belonged. One bright spring morning, the snow melted into clear streams and the fields turned green again. The first flowers pushed through the soil. Maylin stood outside, hanging clean sheets on the line, the sun warm on her face. Across the road, Daniel was fixing a fence. When their eyes met, he raised his hand in greeting, not like a stranger, but like someone who had found a friend. He walked over with a small wooden box in his hands. "Brought you something," he said. Inside the box were small herb plants, mint, thyme, and spring onions. "Figured you might grow them near the kitchen," he said a little shyly. Maylin's eyes lit up. "For cooking," she said happily. He nodded. "For cooking." The boarding house garden slowly filled with those herbs. Whenever Maylin cooked with them, the smell carried through the town, warm and welcoming. People said the food tasted even better now. Daniel often came to sit on the porch, not saying much, just watching the sunset with her after a long day. Time moved gently, like a river. The frontier wasn't an easy place, but Maylin no longer faced it alone. She had a home, friends, and a bond she never expected. The man who once glared at her through the fence now stood beside her, quietly proud to have her near. And though neither of them spoke grand words, their story became part of the town's quiet history. How a young woman with a single trunk and strong hands crossed the ocean, faced a storm, and softened the heart of a fierce rancher without ever raising her voice. People would later say that Maylin brought more than food to that cold winter. She brought warmth, the kind that doesn't melt with snow.